excellence, for we had owned that meadow from the time of the great Alfred, and even when that good king lay in the Isle of Athelney, he had a Ridd along with him. Now I spoke to Lorna gently, seeing how much she had been tried, and I praised her for her courage in not having run away, when she was so unable; and my darling was pleased with this, and smiled upon me for saying it, though she knew right well that in this matter my judgment was not impartial. But you may take this as a general rule, that a woman likes praise from the man whom she loves, and cannot stop always to balance it. Now expecting a sharp attack that night, when Jeremy Stickles the more expected after the words of Carver, which seemed to be meant to mislead us, we prepared a great quantity of knuckles of pork, and a ham in full cut, and a fillet of hung mutton; for we would almost surrender rather than keep our garrison hungry. And all our men were exceedingly brave, and counted their rounds of the house in half pints. Before the maidens went to bed, Lorna made a remark which seemed to me a very clever one, and then I wondered how on earth it had never occurred to me before. But first she had done a thing which I could not in the least approve of, for she had gone up to my mother, and thrown herself in her arms, and begged to be allowed to return to Glen Doone. "My child, are you unhappy here?" mother asked her very gently, for she had begun to regard her now as a daughter of her own. "Oh no, too happy, by far too happy, Mrs. Ridd. I never knew rest or peace before, or met with real kindness. But I cannot be so ungrateful, I cannot be so wicked, as to bring you all into deadly peril for my sake alone. Let me go; you must not pay this great price for my happiness." "Dear child, we are paying no price at all," replied my mother, embracing her. "We are not threatened for your sake only. Ask John, he will tell you. He knows every bit about politics, and this is a political matter." Dear mother was rather proud in her heart, as well as terribly frightened, at the importance now accruing to Plover's Barrows farm; and she often declared that it would be as famous in history as the Rye House, or the Meal Tub, or even the Great Black Box, in which she was a firm believer. And even my knowledge of politics could not move her upon that matter. Such things had happened before, she would say, shaking her head with its wisdom, and why might they not happen again? Women would be women, and men would be men, to the end of the chapter; and if she had been in Lucy Water's place, she would keep it quiet as she had done. And then she would look around, for fear lest either of her daughters had heard her. "But now, can you give me any reason why it may not have been so? You are so fearfully positive, John, just as men always are." "No," I used to say, "I can give you no reason why it may not have been so, mother. But the question is, if it was so or not, rather than what it might have been. And I think it is pretty good proof against it, that what 9 men of every 10 in England would only too gladly believe, if true, is nevertheless kept dark from them." "There you are, John," mother would reply, "all about men, and not a single word about women. If you had any argument at all, you would own that marriage is a question upon which women are the best judges." "Oh," I would groan in my spirit, and go, leaving my dearest mother quite sure that now at last she must have convinced me. But if mother had known that Jeremy Stickles was working against the Black Box and its issue, I doubt whether he would have fared so well, even though he was a visitor. However, she knew that something was doing, and something of importance, and she trusted in God for the rest of it. Only she used to tell me, very seriously, of an evening, "The very least they can give you, dear John, is a coat of arms. Be sure you take nothing less, dear, and the farm can well support it." But lo, I have left Lorna ever so long, anxious to consult me upon political matters. She came to me, and her eyes alone asked 100 questions, which I rather had answered upon her lips than troubled her pretty ears with them. Therefore I told her nothing at all, save that the attack, if any should be, would not be made on her account, and that if she should hear by any chance a trifle of noise in the night, she was to wrap the clothes around her, and shut her beautiful eyes again. On no account, whatever she did, was she to go to the window. She liked my expression about her eyes, and promised to do the very best she could; and then she crept so very close that I needs must have her closer, with her head on my breast, and she asked, "Can't you keep out of this fight, John?" "My own one," I answered, gazing through the long black lashes at the depths of radiant love, "I believe there will be nothing; but what there is, I must see out." "Shall I tell you what I think, John? It is only a fancy of mine, and perhaps it is not worth telling." "Let us have it, dear, by all means. You know so much about their ways." "What I believe is this, John. You know how high the rivers are, higher than ever they were before, and twice as high, you have told me. I believe that Glen Doone is flooded, and all the houses under water." "You little witch," I answered, "what a fool I must be not to think of it! Of course it is, it must be. The torrent from all the Bagworthy forest, and all the valleys above it, and the great drifts in the glen itself, never could have outlet down my famous waterslide. The valley must be under water, 20 feet at least. Well, if ever there was a fool, I am he, for not having thought of it." "I remember once before," said Lorna, reckoning on her fingers, "when there was heavy rain all through the autumn and winter, 5 or it may be 6 years ago, the river came down with such a rush that the water was 2 feet deep in our rooms, and we all had to camp by the cliff edge. But you think that the floods are higher now, I believe I heard you say, John." "I don't think about it, my treasure," I answered. "You may trust me for understanding floods, after our work at Tiverton; and I know that the deluge in all our valleys is such that no living man can remember, neither will ever behold again. Consider 3 months of snow, 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 and a fortnight of rain on the top of it, and all to be drained in a few days away; and great barricades of ice still in the rivers, blocking them up, and ponding them. You may take my word for it, Mistress Lorna, that your pretty bower is 6 feet deep." "Well, my bower has served its time," said Lorna, blushing as she remembered all that had happened there; "and my bower now is here, John. But I am so sorry to think of all the poor women flooded out of their houses, and sheltering in the snowdrifts. However, there is one good of it: they cannot send many men against us, with all this trouble upon them." "You are right," I replied. "How clever you are! And that is why there were only 3 to cut off Master Stickles. And now we shall beat them, I make no doubt, even if they come at all. And I defy them to fire the house; the thatch is too wet for burning." We sent all the women to bed quite early, except Gwenny Carfax and our old Betty. These 2 we allowed to stay up, because they might be useful to us, if they could keep from quarrelling. For my part, I had little fear, after what Lorna had told me, as to the result of the combat. It was not likely that the Doones could bring more than 8 or 10 men against us, while their homes were in such danger; and to meet these we had 8 good men, including Jeremy and myself, all well armed and resolute, besides our 3 farm servants, and the parish clerk, and the shoemaker. These 5 could not be trusted much for any valiant conduct, although they spoke very confidently over their cans of cider; neither were their weapons fitted for much execution, unless it were at close quarters, which they would be likely to avoid. Bill Dadds had a sickle, Jem Slocombe a flail, the cobbler had borrowed the constable's staff (for the constable would not attend, because there was no warrant), and the parish clerk had brought his pitch pipe, which was enough to break any man's head. But John Fry, of course, had his blunderbuss, loaded with tin tacks and marbles, and more likely to kill the man who discharged it than any other person; but we knew that John had it only for show, and to describe its qualities. Now it was my great desire, and my chiefest hope, to come across Carver Doone that night, and settle the score between us; not by any shot in the dark, but by a conflict man to man. And yet, since I came to full grown power, I had never met any one whom I could not play teetotum with; but now at last I had found a man whose strength was not to be laughed at. I could guess it in his face, I could tell it in his arms, I could see it in his stride and gait, which more than all the rest betray the substance of a man. And being so well used to wrestling, and to judge antagonists, I felt that here, if anywhere, I had found my match. Therefore I was not content to abide within the house, or go the rounds with the troopers, but betook myself to the rick yard, knowing that the Doones were likely to begin their onset there; for they had a pleasant custom, when they visited farmhouses, of lighting themselves towards picking up anything they wanted, or stabbing the inhabitants, by first creating a blaze in the rick yard. And though our ricks were all now of mere straw, except indeed 2 of prime clover hay, and although on the top they were so wet that no firebrands might hurt them, I was both unwilling to have them burned, and fearful that they might kindle, if well roused up with fire upon the windward side. By the by, these Doones had got the worst of this pleasant trick one time; for happening to fire the ricks of a lonely farm called Yeanworthy, not far above Glenthorne, they approached the house to get people's goods, and to enjoy their terror. The master of the farm was lately dead, and had left inside the clock case, loaded, the great long gun, wherewith he had used to sport at the ducks and the geese on the shore. Now widow Fisher took out this gun, and not caring much what became of her, for she had loved her husband dearly, she laid it upon the window sill which looked upon the rick yard, and she backed up the butt with a chest of oak drawers, and she opened the window a little back, and let the muzzle out on the slope. Presently 5 or 6 fine young Doones came dancing a reel, as their manner was, betwixt her and the flaming rick; upon which she pulled the trigger with all the force of her thumb, and a quarter of a pound of